I'm Guðmundur Kristjánsson. I'm the creative director and co-founder of 1939 Games. So Kards, it has a bit of a long backstory. I mean, I think it all started with these little plastic soldiers. You know, when I was a kid, I used to have hundreds and thousands of these little guys. They played out epic battles, of course. Me and my friends and cousins were playing with plastic, you know, these model kits and things like that. And so at a very early age I got very interested in World War II through that initially, but then also through board games and just comics and things like that. I was always really fascinated about World War II, even if it's not the finest hour of human history. There's a lot of there's something so fascinating about the scale of the struggle and all the technology and you know the different strategies of the different nations and all that. It just speaks to me in some way. So I started playing card games when I was pretty old. I was probably around 21 or something like that. When a friend of mine showed me Magic the Gathering for the first time. I thought I was a really cool guy at the time, and was mostly just partying with my friends and drinking a bit. And I thought this looked really nerdy to begin with, but then I completely got sucked into it. We were playing a lot of Magic, and of course I spent all my little money I had at the time on buying booster packs. But I really loved Magic from the get-go. How really simple the kind of core mechanics of Magic are, how easy it is to learn. And another thing also which I really like, the combination of artwork and the game mechanics, how it kind of fuels your imagination, the pictures on the cards, even if it's just like in our game, it's basically a really simple numbers game, if you will. But with the context and the artwork and all that stuff and the visual effects, then it inspires your imagination. It becomes something much more, much like when I was playing with these little plastic soldiers when I was a kid. They were, of course, not plastic anymore when you have set up a giant battle and you are playing around with them. It's all about the imagination. So the inspiration behind Kards definitely comes from a lifelong interest in World War II, first and foremost, but also in card games and board games and strategy games. The strategy in board games I played, specifically the war games, were like Panzer Blitz and Panzer Leader. There were hexagon games with tons of counters all over the map. Flat Top was one that me and a cousin of mine played a lot, which is a aircraft carrier, also counter hexagon game. But then also played tons of Axis and Allies and Risk, of course, which is a bit the mother of all grand scale strategy games. So Axis and Allies is a fantastic strategy game, really grand scale strategy game, pretty simple and easy to get into. So I played probably thousands of hours with my friends of Axis and Allies. So basically you're playing the 5 major powers of World War II. The war starts at a certain period in the war, the beginning of the war, and then you can try to alter history by moving your military units around the board, the world map. So it's actually a pretty historically accurate game, but what me and some friends of mine did very early on, we started modding Axis and Allies, and I think we actually played a lot more the modded versions, and they were not as historically accurate. There we were kind of trying to get the replay value out of the game by keeping some of the core mechanics, but completely changing the starting positions, and everyone was playing against each other, so the traditional lines of Axis and Allies were not really there anymore. And then there was a lot of strategy and alliances were made and backstabbing and things like that. Yeah, maybe modding this game was probably one of the first kind of attempts to dabble a little bit with game design. It started kind of with I was working at a gaming studio in Iceland called CCP at the time, the makers of EVE Online, and by far the biggest gaming company in Iceland. I had not been playing card games for 10 or 15 years at the time, but some co-workers, we were playing Magic at lunchtime, and so I started dabbling around with Magic a little bit. Then I just thought to myself, there must be a World War II card game out there, and I just started looking for it, started browsing online, and didn't really find anything. It didn't seem like anyone had made a serious attempt of making a World War II collectible card game, which I think was strange, because I think immediately, when I think of it, it's a match made in heaven. So that was where the idea came from first, and then it was pretty clear to me that I wanted somehow to take the essence of the traditional collectible card game, like Magic and those types of games, but fuse it with elements from these strategy and war games and board games that I've been playing since I was a kid and also really loved. Yeah, so there are some core principles that are inherited from the tabletop games. We knew we wanted to include some core war elements like movement, range, different behavior of different military unit types, and maybe some of the logistics of warfare. So those are the main innovations that we bring to the card game. They are represented mainly around the concept of the front line, which is a line in the middle of the board where you need to move your ground units to be able to attack the enemy. I think we kind of nailed those core principles pretty well there. In regards to the logistics, we also added a feature called operation cost. So not only do you have to pay resources to play out your units and give your orders and things like that, but you also have to use your resources to operate them. So to attack and move with your units, you have to pay some resources for that as well. And that is an attempt to reflect the logistics of, you have to supply your armies and reinforce them and all that, which is a big part of warfare. So of course, originally it was much more complicated. In our original designs, you had more lines, many more types of units and all kinds of special rules, 3 or 4 different types of resources. So we've kind of simplified the game a lot since then and just tried to keep it to the bare minimum where you get these kind of elements while the game is still a card game and it hasn't turned into a full-blown, complicated board game. Well, of course, it's the only card game out there that is not set in a fantasy or sci-fi setting, at least if you're looking at the bigger games. It offers you a completely different kind of stimulation to your imagination. As for the context of World War II, as opposed to elves and trolls and all this typical fantasy setting in card games, I think it is twofold. Maybe for me, maybe I was a little bit tired of the fantasy setting because it has been used so much in the context of card games especially. And we wanted to bring something else to the table, but it's also, like I've explained before, I've always had this deep passion for World War II. So I think that's a narrative that we are, I'm at least much better suited to kind of bring that world to life than a game in a fantasy setting. We try to, be historically accurate as we can. We've always said that, the fun of playing the game comes before anything else, and if we have to, bend historical accuracy a little bit for that, then we definitely always do that. As mentioned before, I was obsessed when I was a kid with these tiny little plastic soldiers and the plastic models from Matchbox and Airfix. So it was really interesting for us when we started thinking about the artwork for Kards. We actually just started to contact some of these artists who did the box art of the model kits and things like that back in the 80s. So some of these artists are, really old today, but it was really a bit of a dream come true when some of them that are absolute legends in that field agreed to take part in this project with us. When designing Kards, we knew from the start that we wanted to capture the feeling of sitting at an actual table playing cards. You should feel like you're playing cards against your opponent. So there's just something cozy, so to speak. Sitting at the table, playing cards against someone, it's just a nice feeling. I think people kind of identify with that. And since it is a card game, I think the most natural way of designing it is to try to make it feel like you're actually playing cards. Why would you have a card game that then feels like, a computer game? We have been focusing quite a lot on having the cards move a little bit like they would in an actual, if you're playing cards, and behaving in the hand, as they would. People should get this kind of nice feeling that they are actually sitting at the table playing a card game with someone else, because that's just, people like that. And for example, for me, it's like if you compare it to sitting at the table and playing chess with a friend, or playing chess online, it's a completely different feeling. And we wanted to try to be more on this kind of intimate playing cards, trying to capture that somehow.
So, Kards really is the history of the Second World War. It's been woven into the fabric of the game from its inception to represent real-world history in the card game genre, and not just the fantasy setting that we've come to know from this type of games. And if you actually look at the high-level identities of the nation, both from World War II and in Kards, you can see that historical connection extremely clearly.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about World War II and its main factions, the nations that fought in the war. Nazi Germany invaded Poland the 1st of September 1939. With relative ease, the German army, the Wehrmacht, destroyed Poland's fighting force. Britain and France declared war on Germany in order to protect Poland, but contrary to Poland's hopes, did not come to its aid in other ways. So Poland surrendered. Britain and France prepared themselves for war, thinking their defenses based on massive artillery and fortifications would hold any German attack. In just 2 weeks, in 1940, the Wehrmacht stormed through the defenses of both Belgium and France and pushed the British army into the sea. In only 6 weeks, France, which supposedly had the best army in Europe at the time, surrendered. The reason for this was a new style of combat with which the Wehrmacht fought. The essence of the new style was speed. The so-called blitzkrieg or lightning war was the combination of quick movement of troops and tanks and the massive use of air power to support the infantry. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, used as air support one of the most feared weapons in the war, the Stuka, an airplane that made a menacing sound when it dived in to bomb a target. German generals like Guderian and Manstein had perfected the use of swift panzer divisions and radio technology to be very maneuverable in the field. Meanwhile, their enemies set up defenses like they used to in World War I. The Blitzkrieg was to be so extremely effective that in a couple of years, the biggest part of mainland Europe had fallen to the Nazis. But to the Nazis, their main ideological enemy still stood in the form of communist Soviet Union. To deal with that enemy, the Germans gathered the largest invasion force ever in the history of warfare. At the western border of the Soviet Union, on the eve of battle, the Wehrmacht had around 3.5 million men, 3,350 tanks, and more than 5,300 aircraft. What started with Operation Barbarossa, which was the name used for the invasion, was to become one of the most horrifying wars of all time. The Germans gained the upper hand during the early stages of the invasion. They even made it as far as the outskirts of Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. But prolonged warfare wasn't to be Wehrmacht's strong suit. Even though they'd started to produce some very powerful and effective tanks like the Panther and the Tiger tanks, the Eastern Front would be too draining on manpower and the resources for the German army in the end. During that time, they also had to deal with Britain and later the US. The German Navy couldn't compete with the Royal Navy for the control of the seas, so they had to dive below the sea to fight with their famous U-boats and started to hunt merchant vessels and battleships alike. They also tried to bomb Britain into submission in the so-called Blitz. The Luftwaffe attacked Britain's industrial cities to try and destroy both Britain's fighting spirit and also their war industry. In 1943, the war was all but lost for the Germans, but still they used what they had to carry on the fight. They made new machinery, used their technological capabilities, and very disciplined soldiers to keep the war going for 2 years until they finally surrendered in 1945.
Germany were the aggressors in the war. They started the war by invading Poland in 1939, and they fought with a fierce fighting style called the Blitzkrieg that used speed in a way that it hadn't been used before, and absolutely decimated their enemies with swift infantry, airstrikes, and mobile tanks. And that's why in the game Cards, the Germans are represented with the aggressive archetype. It means that they have a lot of cheap units that can move aggressively and put pressure really early on. But in the war, they also had amazing pieces of technology and big, massive tanks and artillery weapons. So you can also wield mid to late game decks with Germany, focusing on big units like the Tiger or the Leopold. Now, if we look at some specific cards from Germany, one of the cards in the game is called Greif. And Greif was the command vehicle for Rommel in his North African campaign. And just like in North Africa, if you play Greif in Cards, your tanks now operate for one less in addition to you getting a new unit. So much like having the Desert Fox at the helm, you have much more strategic availability than you did before. So that card represents being led by Rommel and all the strategic options that afforded them in the Second World War. If you look at another German card, and this one is iconic, it's called Blitzkrieg. It's simple. It's an order you play that gives all your frontline units +3 attack. And much like in history, where the Germans could completely surprise their opponents with mobilizing a massive amount of forces to the front line and dealing swift, damaging blows, you can do that in Cards in the same way.
At the time when World War II started, it was the largest empire in the history. It had been in the Victorian era called the empire on which the sun never sets. Britain's power lay in its navy. The Royal Navy was the largest in the world. Its role was to be the first line of defense for the British Isles and to keep the Commonwealth together. Before the war, Britain only had a small professional army, but during the first months of the war, they started to conscript young men into what would become their expeditionary force. Fighting in Norway, Belgium and France in 1940, the expeditionary force was defeated on all fronts, so they had to retreat from Europe's mainland. With the evacuation of Dunkirk, the fighting shifted from the ground to the air and sea. Seeing that they could not defeat Germany on their own, they started to make plans to defend their island and the Commonwealth. In that lay the strength of Britain. Winning the battle for Britain, even though it was a tight fight, made them see how important aerial supremacy was. Using the famous Spitfire and Hurricane airplanes, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, prevented the Luftwaffe from gaining supremacy in the air, and by doing that, obstructed the German invasion of Britain. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill said, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few," referring to the British victory in the Battle for Britain. At the same time, the Royal Navy fought German U-boats in the Atlantic Ocean. The Navy had to protect merchant vessels, trying to keep the British population fed and to bring in raw materials for the war. That fighting in the Atlantic Ocean took almost the whole war, but ending in British victory over the U-boat. After the Battle for Britain, the Luftwaffe changed its focus from trying to gain aerial supremacy over the skies to the Blitz, bombing of British cities. Retaliating, the RAF started to bomb German cities, which would intensify during the whole war. The famous Lancaster bombers were the main aircraft used for British bombing raids. The latter part of the war, Britain took part in land fighting in North Africa, Italy, and took part in invading Europe with their American allies. During both the D-Day landings and in the North African battles, the main British commander was Montgomery, or Monty, as he was called. Britain would stand in the end as one of the victors of the war, having been fighting almost from the very start in 1939 to 1945.
So Britain was the second nation to join the war. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the British and the French declared war against Nazi Germany, and the fight began. They formed the British Expeditionary Forces and sent them out to the fronts to start fighting the war. Unfortunately, during the first year of combat, they suffered heavy losses, which led to the Dunkirk evacuation. From 1940 until 1941, the British kept on fighting, mostly alone, against a strong and aggressive German power. They showed tremendous resilience in protecting the UK and Britain from invasion, and through the Battle of Britain, denied Germany the aerial superiority they needed to stage an invasion into the UK. Because of the control and influence that they exerted over the war, the archetype in game that Britain represents is the control archetype, meaning that they have plenty of units that you can buff the HP of, that have guard that can protect sensitive targets, and a bunch of control orders that allow you to slow down the pace of your enemy to get your board under control. Now, if you look at some explicit examples of cards in the game that Britain has to offer, the first one is the number 10 Commando. Now, the Commandos were a legendary fighting force in the Second World War. They were a small group of elite soldiers that often carried out missions behind enemy lines without a lot of support, striking from the shadows and being a thorn in the side of the Germans throughout the entire war effort. Now, in Cards, they play very similarly. When you play them out, you get a small infantry unit on board, but it has smokescreen, meaning that it's able to hide from all the action. And then every time you play an order, it does one random damage to a random opponent on the board, quickly becoming a thorn in the side of your opponent, just as they were in the side of Nazi Germany during the war. Another card that Britain has to offer is called Ultra, and that refers to the ultra-secret designation that decrypted communication via radio and teleprinter from the Axis powers were designated as ultra-secret from the Allies. And that's a step above the highest designation before they managed to crack the code, which was most secret. So in the game, Ultra does very much the same thing. It cracks your opponent's code and means that when you play it and your opponent plays an order, it counters it and gives you a card. So you're able to, in a proactive way, stop your opponent from making the next move.
In 1939 and in 1940, the US public opinion was to not intervene and remain isolated, as they had enough of European problems in World War I and its aftermath. Despite that, the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was an ardent supporter of Britain during those first years of the war and supplied Britain with raw material and even weapons. It wasn't until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor that the US joined the war. By doing so, it has been said that the Japanese woke up a sleeping giant. At first, not ready for war, the US was made the arsenal of democracy, after being swung into action, mobilizing troops and reorganizing the industry for war. Production rose nearly 30% during the war. This was costly, but patriotic Americans were ready to buy war bonds to support the war effort. the US had the problem of having to fight at two fronts at the same time. The Pacific Front against the Japanese and the European North African Front against Germany. In the European front, they started by supplying the Soviet Union and Britain with material for the war, by taking part in fighting in North Africa, and finally by bombing Germany. The US had made heavy bombers named Boeing B-17, but called the Flying Fortress, which now came into good use. The US bombed Germany by the day, but the RAF bombed during the night. At the Pacific Front, in the famous Battle of Midway, the US made a severe blow to Japan, emerging as a clear-cut victor over the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was the US aircraft carriers that won the day, but winning Midway didn't win the war. The Japanese Imperial Army would not give up any piece of ground without a fight. Because of that, US Marines had to hop between islands and fight in hostile tropical climates against not only their enemy, but tropical diseases in places like Guadalcanal. In the end, US production capacity and resources proved more than a handful for the Japanese, and the Marines started to win island after island. In Europe, the Allies with US soldiers in the forefront invaded the mainland. First they invaded Italy, then the D-Day landings in France. Brutal fighting against hardened German soldiers took its toll on the soldiers, but they also gained experience during the early battles. Just like in the Pacific Front, it was the manpower and production capabilities that made the US war effort in Europe successful. In the end, the war transformed the US into a superpower and may be the greatest victor of the Second World War.
So when the Second World War started, the USA weren't really ready for a fight. They didn't have as many soldiers as they wanted, but what they did have was immense production capabilities and really good technology. And they leveraged those strengths as much as they could. And when they entered the war effort in 1941, they immediately started supplying all the Allies with raw materials, weapons, and a whole lot of support. They also ended up running bombing runs during the day on German targets and providing a ton of support. Now, because production and outproducing your opponent was such a core theme to what the United States did during the Second World War, they are represented in Kards as the ramp archetype, meaning that you amass resources in the early game to take over your opponent so you can play bigger and better units while they're still stuck in the early game. And to fuel all this additional production and all this additional cost at home from the US, general public in the USA bought war bonds to finance the war efforts. So if we look at two cards that the USA has to offer in Kards, the first one is war bonds, and it's effectively the same as the war bonds were in real life. In the game, you're able to spend 5 credits to effectively purchase an additional 2 credits of resources, allowing you to skip 2 turns ahead and get an additional card next turn, meaning that you'll have enough resources in hand to properly use your added capabilities. The second card that we have from them is a legendary bomber called the B-17 Flying Fortress, and it was a vehicle and a bomber that was used to devastating effect in the Second World War. And much like the destruction that the B-17 wrecked during the World War, it also has destructive capabilities in Kards. In fact, when you play the card, its deployment effect is to destroy a random enemy. On top of that, you're left with this big unit on board that can be really tough to deal with for your opponent.
The World War came sooner to the Japanese than most other nations when they invaded China in 1937. The fighting took longer than expected and it started to drain up Japan's natural resources and manpower. For an island nation of around 70 million people, it was bad news. The Western powers did not look fondly upon the Sino-Japanese War, so they started to cut off Japanese oil imports. Things were starting to look grave indeed. The Japanese had to do something drastic. They decided to look for raw materials in Southeast Asia. To do that, they had to take out their main threat in the area, the USA and its Pacific Fleet. In 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor with airplanes and submarines. They took control of the skies above the island by using their famous airplanes Zeros and bombing American battleships into smithereens. And only a few weeks after the successful attack, they invaded Thailand, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, and even getting as far as the Dutch East Indies at taking the prized possession of its oil fields, occupying a large part of Southeast Asia and many key Pacific islands. The power of the Japanese did not come from their technology or mechanics like the Germans, nor did they have plenty of resources like the US or manpower like the Soviet Union. Their power came from the mindset of their soldiers, their superhuman patriotism. I think few people living today can understand. I think the best example of that is 2nd Lieutenant Onoda, who didn't surrender until 1972, though the war had ended 27 years earlier. The willingness of the soldiers to sacrifice themselves for the Japanese Empire was something that shocked their enemies. They had believed that the American Navy was crippled, but in the Battle of Midway, the tide turned against the Japanese. Like the Germans, they couldn't win the war of attrition. US forces started to island hop across the ocean, capturing occupied territories, and increasingly cutting Japan off from vital supplies. Fighting was vicious and cruel, and few prisoners taken. When things did start to look increasingly bleak for the Japanese Empire, in 1944 they made special attack units called kamikaze, who flew explosive-filled aircrafts in suicide attacks against Allied ships. Kamikaze meant the divine wind and referred to when the invading Mongol fleet was destroyed in a typhoon and saved Japan in 1274. Because of the fierce fighting will and the superhuman patriotism of the Japanese soldiers, war in the Pacific took longer than the European front. After nuclear attacks and fearing that the Soviet Union would take part in invading Japan, they surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945.
During the Second World War, the Japanese displayed loyalty to their country that most people in the world can't start to fathom. In what became known as superhuman patriotism, the Japanese were readily willing to risk life and limb in order to win the Japanese military strategic victories. This is represented in Kards by the Japanese fulfilling the aggressive burn archetype, meaning that you're looking to flood the board with cheap units that rely on destruction effects and other damaging effects to reach across the playing field and deal damage to strategically important objectives like the enemy headquarters. They also use a combination of high-powered spells that can do direct damage and mass removal to open up the playing field. Now, if we look at some cards that Japanese has to offer, the first one is the 41st Bicycle Regiment. But unbeknownst to many, the Japanese actually employed bicycles quite a bit in their warfare, and it served them really well in the Pacific theater. Each soldier was able to carry up to 36 kilos of equipment, so they were able to effectively maneuver their forces and equipment around using these bikes. Now, in Kards, this is represented by the 41st Bicycle Regiment being a cheap, low-powered infantry unit that is able to move and attack within the same turn it is played, effectively covering a lot of ground and putting immediate pressure on your opponent. On top of that, it has the Fury ability, allowing it to strike twice within the same turn, much as the Bicycle Regiment did in real life, seemingly attacking out of nowhere. The second card we can look at is called Desperate Measures. But in 1944, most of the high-level military and political staff in Japan had come to realize that the victory wasn't coming. And what they employed then were truly desperate measures. with the hopes that a continued loss of life on the Allied side would allow them to retain ownership of some of the areas that they conquered in Asia during the Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese ordered their soldiers to carry out suicide attacks against Allied targets, leading to some of the bloodiest battles in World War II. In Cards, this is represented with desperate measures being a low-cost order that deals massive damage to all your opponents, but at the same time removes a credit slot from the player that plays it, effectively crippling their ability to continue on with the war effort, much like the Japanese crippled their own ability to continue on by sacrificing their soldiers in these suicide attacks.
When Germany finally attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army was completely unprepared. Stalin had purged many of the Red Army's best commanders and did not believe that Hitler was going to attack because of their non-aggression pact. So when the Wehrmacht made the attack in the summer of 1941, they overran the armies that were supposed to safeguard the Soviet Union's western border. Stalin and his commanders put forth against the onslaught massive amounts of almost untrained soldiers to counter the attack. Of course, those soldiers didn't do well in the fight against better trained and better equipped Germans. Using their blitzkrieg tactic, the Wehrmacht had the upper hand to begin with, taking control over large part of Soviet territory, while the Red Army suffered over 3 million casualties. But as the war went on, the Soviets started to make use of their industrial power. They moved their factories to the east, to the foothills of the Ural Mountains, where they were safer against both the German army and the Luftwaffe. From those factories, they made some of their best tanks of the war, like the T-34 and the KV tanks, and made better airplanes like the Jag-3 that could compete against Luftwaffe for the control of the skies. From their allies, they also got help. The US and Britain sent large convoys to Murmansk in the north of the Soviet Union with supplies of weapons, food, and other resources they needed for the war. When invading Russia, Hitler thought that the Red Army would collapse like a house of cards, but the Red Army proved him terribly wrong. The Soviet people called the war the Great Patriotic War, filled with love of the motherland and hatred of the invader. The Red Army and the Soviet civilians fought heroically. Those that weren't called off for armed services dug anti-tank ditches in front of their cities to defend them from the panzers and aided the war effort in other ways. Stalin also issued Order 227, not one step back, urging the Red Army to not give away any more of Soviet ground. During the years 1942 to 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad took place, one of the most brutal engagements of the whole war. In that battle, the tables turned dramatically, and the Red Army fought ferociously in the city of Stalingrad, a large industrial city known for manufacturing tanks and armaments. Fighting from one house to another, the Frontovikis, as the Soviets called their infantry, managed to fight off the Germans. The fighting didn't stop there, but as the war went on, the Red Army gained more and more ground. Germans feared the Soviet Union more than they feared the Western powers, so giving up the ground easily wasn't an option. The Red Army finally chased the Germans all the way to Berlin, where they defeated the Wehrmacht, once and for all, in horrible street fighting.
When the Second World War started, the Soviets were completely unprepared for battle. They didn't have a whole lot of soldiers, so they needed more manpower and fast. So they sent out the call and they amassed staggering numbers of people that were willing to serve the motherland. And they fielded them against a much better trained and much better equipped German forces, racking up immense casualties early in the war. Later on, they moved their headquarters and manufacturing capabilities over to the Ural Mountains and proceeded to produce some of the most effective pieces of machinery during the entire war effort, including the legendary T-34 tank. Now in Cards, both of these identities of the Soviet Empire is represented. So the first archetype that Soviets fulfill is tokens. And what tokens stand for is the ability to spawn a massive amount of cheap, low health, low attack units that are able to march across the battlefield and put pressure on your opponent, much like the Red Army did in real life. And this is something that the Soviets do really well in Cards. However, they also do have the ability to field these great pieces of machinery that they built in the later part of the war, like the Joseph Stalin and the T-34 and the Katyusha. So if you want to build a Soviet deck that is more centered around these high-value units and valuable trading, that's something you can do as well. If we take a look at two of the cards that Soviets have to offer, the first one here is called Reserves. Now, Reserves is a low-cost order that gives you 2 light infantry units into your hand that you can play for cheap, plus an additional light infantry unit for each one of these cards you've played before, meaning that you can get all the way up to 6 light infantry units for playing one of these if it's the last one you play out of the set during the game. Now, this is reminiscent of how the Red Army conscripted a whole lot of new soldiers and fielded them really quickly onto the battlefield. The second card we want to take a look at is the Katyusha, the legendary multiple rocket launcher that the Soviets used to devastating effect in the Second World War. What's interesting about the Katyusha is that no one knew it existed before it was used in battle in 1941, and it completely caught the Germans off guard and obliterated them in that fight. Now, much like in real life, you're able to surprise your opponents in Cards with the Katyusha because it's an artillery unit that can fire across the entire battlefield, and you can play it and attack with it during the same turn. It also has the ability to potentially deal 1 extra damage to your opponent, possibly swinging the tides of the battle.
Start by taking a look at how USA plays in Cards by recreating a battle against Japan. Now, USA is the ramp archetype, and Japan, true to form here, starts by playing cheap infantry units, with the 41st Bicycle Regiment already taking the front line and threatening our HQ. Their German allies are there to back them up, supporting them from the back line and drawing them a card at the end of each turn, meaning that they have a fresh supply of new units to keep pouring on the pressure. Now, all this early pressure forces the USA player here to put down a guard unit and start protecting its HQ. And meanwhile, Japan player isn't letting up with the pressure. So what does the US player do? Yeah, he just ramps, starts amassing those resources, eliminating the biggest threats, and hopefully starts to take over in the later parts of the game. Now Japan, true to form, keeps pouring on the pressure. The Type 93 coming out there, buffing the other units, giving them additional attack power. And meanwhile, with their defenses still intact and the opponent still having to move across the battlefield to deal massive damage to the headquarters, the US player is able to continue to ramp and has now taken the credit lead, meaning that he's able to do more within each turn than his opponent. There's also an important thing here is that in the US player's hand, he has a card from his ally nation, the British, and that is Carpet Bombing. That is a massive AoE spell that deals 3 damage to all the opponents on the board. So the US player knows that he's able to deal with everything that is on board from the Japanese player by playing that card. Now, the board has been cleared, but if we fast forward a couple of turns, we find ourselves in a familiar situation. Even though the board was cleared, the Japanese continue to pour on the pressure. Meanwhile, the US and British are defending their bases against the aggressive burn from the Japanese and the German in the deck. The US player, true to form, continues to stay healthy and amass resources. And you can already see some big, high-cost cards in the hand there, like the 10 credit M26 Pershing there that has the possibility to come out now because of a massive credit gain the US player has gone through. Another carpet bombing later on in the game allows the US player to deal with the continuous pressure from the Japanese. And now with 14 credits to its name, 4 credits more than the opponent, the US player is able to take over the game to secure the victory. Now if we take a look at another battle in Cards, this one between the Soviet Union and the Germans. The Soviets being the token archetype and the Germans being the aggressive archetype. So true to form, the Germans start by playing mobile and swift tanks in the game, and the Soviet Union responds by playing infantry. More tanks and aggression coming out from the Germans is not something that should be surprising, and more infantry coming out of the Soviets. Likewise. The Germans continue on with their aggression, and the death total is starting to add up for the Soviets. And so far, the Germans haven't lost a single unit, meanwhile the Soviets have lost 2. However, the Katyusha coming out is able to turn the tide of the battle, taking care of the frontline pressure from the Germans and allowing the Soviets to mount their defense with more infantry units. However, the Germans keep using their variable fighting force, now fielding planes and powerful orders to clear the board. If we skip ahead a few turns, we see much of the same. The Germans keep pressuring the front line with tanks. Meanwhile, the Soviets keep responding with more infantry. The death toll now on the Soviet side reaching a pretty high number. But that's what Tokens is all about. It's all about fielding a large number of cheap infantry units on the board. Now here the Soviets reach for their US allies during the war, and with their help is able to buff the fighting force and draw another card, allowing him to find a good play with a massively powerful token unit that trades effectively with the front line of the Germans. And this is the power of the tokens. The continuous pressure of infantry, wave after wave, has forced the Germans to retreat back into their base and have to field lightning-quick tanks accompanied with the Blitzkrieg in order to deal quick blows against the Soviet army. Much like in real life, sustained warfare is not the strength of the aggressive German deck in Cards. And by the end, the field is flooded with loyal soldiers that have managed to protect Moscow and are now ready to deliver the finishing blow to their German opponent in this battle. Finally, we take a look at a fight between the British and the Germans. Now, the British are the control archetype in the game, meaning that they like to bring their health total of their HQ up, they want to buff their units, and with the commandos, they want to do scattered damage all over the place, striking from the shadows. They also want to stop the progression of their opponent, and they do that by pinning them, meaning that they're unable to move for a turn. So those are the things to look out for from the British side here. On the German side, the player is playing another German archetype, more of a German value deck, meaning that he is fielding large units and valuable units that are able to put pressure on early. As we see here, he has a powerful unit in the front line that cannot be targeted by orders, already causing me problems. However, if I do get lucky with where my commando decides to hit with these orders, we might be able to take him out. So the British player here continues on with the health buff and indeed manages to land the procs he needs to clear the board and relieve that early pressure from the Germans. Germans deciding to go to the Reichsbank and look for an opportunity to make a massive play next turn, taking out a loan and reaping the rewards in the following turn, bringing 10 credits to the table and possibly opening up the opportunity to playing big, massive units that are hard to deal with. Indeed, within this turn, they're able to play a 4/5 tank unit, reach across the battlefield, and deal massive damage to the Blackwatch Guard unit currently protecting the British headquarters. The British, being the control archetype, have an arsenal of spells that will help them deal with aggression like this, including the one we just saw, that allowed them to deal with the tank in the front line in a very effective way. The Japanese are coming to the Germans' aid here, and a Japanese unit is now guarding the German headquarters. Now the Night Raid gives you a commando, but also steals an order from the opponent's deck, and here we got extremely lucky, because we pulled an elite card called the Kriegsmarine, allowing us to deal damage to the enemy HQ equal to the amount of cards they have in hand, which currently is around 7. It also discards a card from them, so this is a really powerful card for us to have. The Germans continue pouring on the pressure with powerful tanks, infantry units, and airplanes. However, the Kriegsmarine being used against them removes a powerful card and deals a swift blow to their headquarters. The continued use of control means that the German tank is not able to operate in the next turn, and the support line is full, meaning that it's difficult for the German player to play more units without forcing him to spend credits on trading with your unit in the front line. More tanks continue the pressure from the German side, and the British are now starting to become low on resources. However, the smokescreen on the units in the support line mean that they're able to stay alive and hide away from the battle until the right moment. With new units on board, the Germans resume their offensive, pushing the tanks into the front line and swiftly taking down one of the commandos. They move the Japanese unit up as well, protecting the 2 German tanks in the front line and making it difficult and expensive for the British player to trade effectively here. Drawing a naval power and having the Crusader on board, which means that he's able to draw a card when he plays a British order, he pins the unit in the middle, the Japanese unit, and finds an opportunity to trade effectively with the front line of the German player. And because of the smokescreen ability, is able to play the number 10 commando there, meaning that it can't be immediately killed by the opposing tank in the front line. Now, a big and powerful artillery unit coming out of Germany here, the 15 centimeter Autokanon. That is a unit that ends up dealing 2 damage to the enemy headquarters each time you deploy a unit. Accompanying that was the Comet, a swift fighter that is able to come out of hand and deal an attack within the same turn, and then being removed from the battlefield, avoiding any type of retaliation. Now, with another board clear from the British, they're able to work their way back into it and bring the Germans down with a strike from the shadows from one of the commandos in the end.